Hellboy's an interesting character. He's not Batman or Superman, comparatively he's rather niche. Although I do think mainstream audiences recognize him, partly because of his iconic look and striking visuals, but also because of the 3 live-action movies made about him. Given the arrival of a new video game about the character, and constant hints at a new movie being produced, I think now may be a good time to do a detailed retrospective review of the films and give you a general guide to this character. I'll talk a bit about the comics, what to read if you're interested, and a guide of the full reading order. I do recommend reading the comics. In general, I think they're fantastic. In which case, I will avoid giving detailed spoilers on them, and encourage you to simply seek them out if you are interested. Hellboy started getting published in the early 90s by Dark Horse as a creator-owned comic. The comics were created by the artist Mike Mignola, who went from solely doing the art to also doing much of the writing. It's fair to say that Hellboy really is Mike Mignola's baby for the most part. Hellboy's story can be summarized as follows. In the 1940s, Rasputin conducts a world-ending spell under the thumb of the Nazis. What comes from that spell is a tiny red baby, with a stone right hand. He gets found by the Allies rather than the Nazis, and gets raised by Professor Brudenholm, or Professor Broom, and becomes one of the top agents of the BPRD, the Bureau for Paranormal Research and Defense, which was founded partly because of Hellboy. His stories revolve around the question of fate, destiny, and the choice whether to be the demon of prophecy, destroying the world and bringing about the end of all things, or to be the man that chooses his own way. That theme is something I actually quite like. It's not dissimilar from Avatar: The Last Airbender, or specifically the prequels of Star Wars, with some parts of the originals. But the theme is very center stage here. Hellboy has these permanently slouched shoulders, possibly from the weight of his stone right hand, but also the invisible weight he carries with him. I describe the comics as quiet and somber. I don't think they care to be funny, which they don't need to. They take an inherently pulpy concept and turn it into something greater by taking it seriously and not pulling their punches. And this extends to the rest of the Mignola-verse as well. If you're all interested, I suggest picking up the first 2 Hellboy omnibuses. Read those, then go from there. There are a lot of books in this series, and it can be confusing. Thankfully, there are some good guides out there. But there's more than just the comics to discuss. In the 2000s, Guillermo del Toro wrote and directed 2 adaptations of the Hellboy character. I've seen these movies a handful of times now, and I find myself thinking about what it is specifically that sticks out to me. What's different between the comics and these films? What was lost in translation? Why was it lost? And how could it be done better, at least in my mind? Now, Mignola was involved with these films pretty heavily, so it seems insincere to call them poor adaptations. More so, they are different takes on the same principal ideas. Although I do wonder how much involvement the studio had, given just how much the Del Toro films seem to echo Men in Black and the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies from the few years prior. Which leads me to what I think is the majority of the difference between the movies and the comics, that being the tone. More so than just the story and the writing, the tone is fundamentally different from the comics to the movies, and this reflects onto the characters. First and foremost is Hellboy himself, who acts like an angsty teenager cracking one-liners in the movies. I wonder if this is a choice influenced by the success of the Spider-Man movies from the few years prior. But the difference is that that's actually something integral to Spider-Man's character. He's always done it, and it works for his stories. Hellboy is generally pretty quiet, and he certainly doesn't act like a teenager. I would describe his character in the comics as a kind, perceptive, and empathetic big brother character, often being supportive of others, but not one to get involved in everyone else's business unless he feels it necessary. He's an older, blue-collar worker trying to do right by others, but holding on to a massive weight, that being the knowledge that he is a demon, one destined to bring about the end of the world one way or another. So his character is a frustrated one, attempting to live as a good man rather than a demon guided by destiny. The film version is an arrogant loudmouth who feels the need to make a name for himself, and seems in need of validation from his peers, so he plays a hero role, going in alone and not working with others. Other characters get changed too, but not quite as severely. Liz is not romantically involved in Hellboy in the comics. She has a much more tumultuous relationship with the BPRD. Abe is much more human in the comics, rather literally. He doesn't have any powers and essentially a shut-in guy who feels pressured to lead even though he's not great at it. Aside from the character differences, there's also the storytelling differences. The films are fairly fast-paced, moving from one set piece to another, often with little silence between moments of dialogue, which makes sense, of course. It's easier to advertise a movie that's not 3 hours long. But I really felt like most of the scenes lacked punch because they didn't hold on them long enough, which seems to be a trend with blockbusters more recently. The setting and setup for the films seems directly ripped from Men in Black. An agent unfamiliar with this world gets brought in as a rookie, serving as a POV for the audience in a secret government organization hiding a whole other world from the public. It's just switching aliens for the occult. The comics never really felt that way. Where in the movies it's a big Area 51 type thing with super advanced technology and lavish buildings, the comics BPRD work in an office building. It's a little different from what the actual FBI probably works in. Again, this seems to be a change for the sake of marketing. Then the action, which I already briefly touched on. The action in these movies feels overtly slapsticky and cartoony to me. Hellboy gets hit and sent flying, though he looks too slow in the air, so it's obvious he's being pulled by wires. The CGI characters will emote like cartoons, and there's even slapstick sound effects at certain points. I have to imagine these are studio mandates, because this just doesn't gel. The studio must have thought a dark fantasy, led by a big demon man full of quiet introspection and depth, mixed with high-stakes monster fights, wouldn't sell. So, they suggested to make it more kid-friendly and less somber. And I think somber is the right word to use. The comics are often very quiet, sometimes going pages without dialogue or narration, just letting the atmosphere do its trick. Which leads me to my next thought. I don't think Hellboy should be live action, which is somewhat odd since I complained about the films being cartoony, but I think part of that comes from the extreme makeup and costumes being necessary to bring it all to life. Which isn't to say they aren't great. The designs of the characters and monsters all look fantastic, but I think it's easier to accept them and take them seriously in a drawing form than it is in live action. When you attempt to take the willfully surreal art of Mignola and tie it down to physical forms, it becomes slightly awkward to me. Even as good as Ron Perlman is, I can't help but think the makeup looks a bit awkward and stiff. Now, it probably sounds like I hate these movies, which I really don't. It's just not what I want specifically. While I criticize the writing of the character, Perlman is perfect casting. The character designs, makeup, and puppets generally all look fantastic, and there's plenty of good moments in both movies, despite some moments of stiffness. This first movie has those hellhound dogs, and the second has the plant monster and the troll market scene, which feels very Star Wars. And one of the closest scenes to the comics in either movies was when Hellboy and Abe start singing in the second movie.
You came along, just like a song.
Sure, it was goofy, but in a believable way between two friends, and it's something I could see the comic characters doing. Altogether, both Del Toro movies are probably around 3 out of 5. They're fine, with some enjoyable parts, but as a fan of the character, I can't help but question some of the choices made. Because they seem to be produced more so on marketability than on the soul inherent in the character. But there definitely is love for it all in there, wrapped in a bow of studio-mandated slapstick. So the Del Toro movies, at least, have some merits to them. But years later, the 2019 film would be produced to much, much harsher reception. This movie's just stupid. This movie is actually much closer plot-wise to the comics than the Del Toro movies, but it also then proves that accuracy does not a good movie make. The Del Toro films had tone issues for sure, but where I thought they weren't terrible, I think this movie's maybe a 1, possibly a 2 out of 5. I said I thought the Del Toro movies were taking notes from Men in Black and Spider-Man in order to make their films more marketable, but in doing so, this distances them from the source material. Well, I think the same thing is happening here, except swap Spider-Man for Deadpool. This film wasn't doomed from the onset, though. Watching it, I knew the reputation it had as a terrible movie, but I looked for positives. Like I said, the plot is more in line with the comics. It is shifted around a lot, but it's all pulling from the material. The physical effects are mostly pretty good, though the CGI is questionable at times. And I thought David Harbour did pretty great as Hellboy. He was not a bad fit, and I actually prefer the makeup here to the Del Toro movies for him. But the rest of it? Like I said, it isn't doomed. It seemed to me like someone proposed a proper Hellboy movie with horror themes and intense action earning of an R rating. But the production team wanted something more marketable. They suggest to lean into the humor, quicken the pace, pop culture references, etc., etc. With the success of Deadpool, I have to imagine it was a big influence. An R-rated comic book movie filled with violence and humor, do that with Hellboy, it kind of makes sense, except again, it pivots away from the actual material. This film is so fast-paced it often just feels like it lacks confidence in its drama. It doesn't trust itself to land hard-hitting moments, so it just moves on, playing some ill-fitting rock song and making a half-hearted joke, then repeating the F-word over and over to appease its audience of 13-year-olds that think it's the funniest thing on the planet, and throw some gore at them too for good measure. The comics Hellboy rarely had curses from what I remember, and the gore was far less in your face as this movie. It's not disturbing or grotesque, it comes off just crass, like it's going for a reaction. But there are positive moments that did feel right to me, even with the ridiculous and tenuous rest of the movie around it. The beginning where Hellboy seeks out a missing agent, only to kill him in self-defense, for the most part, that seems right. Then seeing his name being added to a list of fallen agents and taking a moment to appreciate that, that's something he would have done in the comic. Seeing Hellboy with his crown, sword, and horns was pretty awesome. The makeup and design is pretty good here, if a bit over-exaggerated and angry-looking. The story this movie is adapting is one I kind of have some issues with in the comics, so here are some minor spoilers. Hellboy is revealed to be the last in the line of King Arthur, and rightful heir to Excalibur, a weapon that could defeat the villainous Nimue, but he turns it down, seeing it as another version of the same sort of prophecy he's been trying to avoid. I feel this is contrived, even in the comics, not having been built up to, and not really coming back again. It just kind of happens, and it's just kind of this reveal that's irrelevant. Thus, an adaptation could, in theory, do it better by retooling this narrative, but the film falls flat on that. It waits until literally the last 20 minutes to spring anything about this. It seems like there probably was someone involved here that genuinely wanted to make a good Hellboy adaptation, but through several layers of pedantry and mass appeal, you wind up with an exceedingly weak product that relies on dumb humor, irreverent dialogue, and gore to appease its audience. It's R-rated, but I think it's clearly aimed at a prepubescent audience that might actually find it endearing. So, to surmise, Hellboy is a niche comic book character that is well worth diving into, even if you have the slightest interest. The films are a mixed bag. The Del Toro movies will definitely have an audience, but I wouldn't say they actually represent the comics. The 2019 film, however, is just a waste. In my opinion, the way to adapt Hellboy would be to make a high-budget animated series following the core story of the Mignolaverse, so the various Hellboy and BPRD comic series. Something that could capture the interesting artistic style of Mignola along with the quiet, somber tone I get from the books. I'll include a detailed guide to the comic reading order for those of you who have any interest in it. I do suggest reading these books. I think they're well worth your time. The movies, I do kind of have mixed thoughts.